This is the 8th installment in our Pillars of Character series, where we explore the quiet virtues that shape a life, a family, and a society from the inside out. Tonight, we turn to courage. Not the loud kind that demands attention, not the kind that seeks applause, but the quiet courage that stands when others bow. The courage that chooses allegiance over approval. The courage that remains steady when pressure rises. In every generation, there comes a moment when comfort invites compromise, when silence feels safer than truth, when bending seems easier than standing. But character is revealed in those moments. In this story, we will walk through 3 movements across centuries: a leader at a river, young exiles before a furnace, fishermen before a council. Each faced a cost, each had a choice, and each discovered that courage does not grow from the absence of fear, but from the presence of something greater. Let us begin.
There is a kind of courage that does not shout. It does not announce itself with clenched fists or fiery speeches. It arrives quietly, like the first light of morning, when the world is still uncertain whether day will come. It is the courage of those who stand not because they are unafraid, but because they have found something more reliable than the absence of fear. They have found a presence. This is the story of 3 such moments, separated by centuries yet woven together by a single thread. A man at a river, young exiles before a furnace, and fishermen before a council. Each faced a cost. Each knew that silence would be safer. And each, in their own way, discovered what it means to stand when everything within them wanted to kneel. If you have ever felt the pull between what you know to be true and the peace that comes from staying quiet, these are your stories too. The morning rose slowly over the eastern hills, as though the sun itself hesitated to illuminate what lay ahead. Mist clung to the banks of the Jordan, like a veil between what had been and what was yet to come, and the water moved with a patience that seemed almost indifferent to the weight of what would soon cross it. Joshua stood alone at the edge of the camp, away from the murmur of voices and the stirring of tents. He had slipped out before dawn, as he often did now, when the questions came loudest and the expectations pressed heaviest. His sandals were wet with dew. His robe, the color of desert stone, hung loosely on shoulders that had carried much, but were now asked to carry more. He was not a young man. The years had marked him, carved lines at the corners of his eyes, and woven silver into the hair of his temples. His hands, calloused from decades of work and war, rested at his sides as he gazed across the water toward the land that had lived only in promise for as long as his people could remember. Moses was gone, and sometimes the person who once steadied you is gone as well. A mentor, a parent, a leader, a season of clarity that no longer answers when you call. There comes a moment when the voice that guided you grows quiet, and the responsibility rests in your own hands. That thought arrived each morning, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything. Moses, who had stood before Pharaoh. Moses, whose voice had carried the very words of the Almighty. Moses, who had known what to say when the people grew afraid and what to do when the path disappeared. And now the voice that had led them was silent, and the people looked to Joshua. He inhaled the morning air, thick with the scent of river water and wild grass. Behind him, he could hear the movement of the camp beginning to stir. Families emerging from tents, children running between cook fires, men sharpening tools and checking provisions. All of them would soon look to him. All of them would wait for him to speak, to lead, to promise them that the land across this river was truly theirs. But who was he to promise anything? Have you ever stood in that same question? Asked to lead, to decide, to step forward when you feel painfully aware of what you lack. Courage often begins not with certainty, but with the ache of inadequacy. Joshua had been faithful. He had served. He had fought when called to fight and waited when called to wait. He had climbed the mountain with Moses and seen things that still woke him in the night with their glory. But he had always been the one who followed, the one who carried out another man's vision. Now the vision was his to carry, and the weight of it pressed upon his chest like a hand he could not push away. The people believed in him because Moses had believed in him. But Moses was not here to reassure them, no. Moses was not here to reassure him. Joshua closed his eyes. The sound of the river filled the silence, constant and unhurried. And in that stillness, he did what he had learned to do in every moment of uncertainty. He turned his attention inward, not to his own thoughts, but to the presence he had come to know like a companion walking beside him. He did not hear a voice the way one hears another person speak. Perhaps you have known something like this yourself. A gentle tug in one direction, a quiet pull at your heart that you were tempted to dismiss as nothing more than your imagination. For Joshua, it was more like remembering something he had always known, but had momentarily forgotten. The words rose within him, like water from a deep spring, and he recognized them as the same words spoken to him in the days after Moses' death, when the grief was fresh and the fear was sharper. As it is written in the book of Joshua, chapter 1, verse 9, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." The words did not remove the fear. They did not make the task smaller, or the enemy weaker, or the path clearer. But they did something else, something that mattered more. They reminded him that courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was remembering who walked beside him when the fear was at its loudest. He opened his eyes, and the river still flowed. The land still waited. The people still needed him to lead. But something had shifted, not in the circumstances, but in the ground beneath his feet. He, like you today, was not standing alone. Joshua had never stood alone, and neither do you. A young man approached from the camp, hesitant, respectful. One of his aides, tasked with bringing word when the elders were ready to gather. "Sir," the young man said, his voice uncertain, "they are asking for you." Joshua turned, and the aide saw something in his face that had not been there moments before. Not confidence, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something settled. "Then let us go to them," Joshua said. He walked back toward the camp with steady steps, the mist parting around him like a curtain being drawn aside. The fear was still there, a quiet hum beneath the surface of his thoughts, but it no longer held him. He carried it the way one carries a familiar burden, acknowledging its weight without being defined by it. The people would follow him across the river, not because he had all the answers, not because he was without doubt, but because he had learned the secret that every frightened leader eventually discovers, that the presence of God is a more reliable foundation than the absence of fear. And sometimes courage is simply putting one foot in front of the other, trusting that the ground will hold because God himself is that ground. The city of Babylon rose from the plain like a dream made solid, its towers catching the light of the afternoon sun and throwing long shadows across streets crowded with merchants, soldiers, and slaves. The air was thick with the smell of incense burning in a dozen temples, with roasting meat from the market stalls, with the sweat of laborers and the perfume of officials. Everywhere there was noise, the clatter of carts on stone, the cries of vendors, the distant sound of drums from the palace quarter, where the king held court in splendor that seemed designed to make every visitor feel small. Hananiah walked through the crowded streets with his two closest friends beside him, their simple garments marking them as court servants of modest rank. their steps unhurried despite the urgency that had been building in the city for days. The Babylonians called them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, names given to them when they had been taken from their homeland as young men, when the empire had stripped away their language, their customs, and the sounds their mothers had used to call them home. But they had learned to carry those new names lightly. Like borrowed robes, they would one day return. Beneath the Babylonian words, they remained who they had always been, children of the God of Abraham, exiles in a foreign court, faithful in quiet ways that drew no attention. Until now. The decree had been issued 3 days prior, announced by heralds in every quarter of the city and posted on tablets at every gate. King Nebuchadnezzar had erected a golden statue on the plain of Dura, a towering image that gleamed like captured sunlight. And at the appointed hour, when the sound of horn and flute and lyre filled the air, every person in the empire was commanded to bow down and worship. The penalty for refusal was clear: the furnace. Shadrach felt the weight of the choice pressing against his chest as they walked, though his face remained calm. He was the eldest of the three by barely a year, olive skin darkened by the Babylonian sun, eyes that held both the softness of youth and the steadiness of someone who had already decided what he would and would not surrender. Beside him, Meshach moved with the quiet grace of a scholar, his mind always working through problems that others had not yet noticed. And Abednego, the youngest, walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw set in the particular way it always set when he was preparing himself for something difficult. They did not speak of the decree as they walked. They had spoken of it already in the quiet of their shared quarters the night before, when the lamps burned low and the city noise had faded to a distant hum. They had spoken carefully, weighing the cost, naming the fear, acknowledging what they stood to lose: their positions at court, the small measure of influence they had earned through years of faithful service, the protection that came from being useful to the empire, perhaps even their lives. But they had also spoken of something else, of the commandment they had learned as children, before the armies came, before the exile, before the strange new names. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. It was not complicated. It was simply costly. There will be others, Meshach had said quietly in the lamplight. Others who refuse. Surely we will not be the only ones. But Shadrach had shaken his head, and his voice had been gentle when he answered. And if we are? Does that change what is true? Now, as they walked toward the plain of Dura, where the statue waited, and the furnace burned, and the music would soon begin, they knew that the moment of decision was almost upon them. The crowd thickened as they approached the assembly ground. Officials in fine robes, soldiers in polished armor, commoners pressed together at the edges, watching with a mixture of curiosity and fear. And there, rising against the sky like a monument to human ambition, the golden statue stood with its blank face turned toward the heavens it pretended to rule. The furnace had been stoked since dawn. Even from a distance, they could feel its heat, could see the shimmer of the air around its mouth, could hear the low roar of the flames within. It had been built large enough to execute many at once, and its message was clear. This was not an idle threat. The music began. Horns first, their sound cutting through the noise of the crowd like a blade through silk. Then the flutes, high and piercing. Then the strings and the drums, building together into a sound that seemed to press down upon the assembly from above. And as the music swelled, the crowd began to move. Knees bent, heads bowed, bodies folded toward the earth in wave after wave of submission. All except three. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood upright, not rigidly, not theatrically. Their hands hung loose at their sides. They did not shout or protest or draw attention to themselves. They simply did not bow. And in a sea of bent backs and lowered heads, three upright figures were impossible to miss. The report reached the king before the music had finished. Certain Chaldean officials, Rivals who had long resented the Hebrew exiles' positions at court brought the accusation with barely concealed satisfaction. The Jews refuse to bow. They serve other gods. They defy the decree. When Nebuchadnezzar summoned them, his face was dark with a fury that seemed all the more dangerous for its quietness. He sat upon a golden throne, surrounded by advisors and guards, and his voice was controlled as he addressed the three young men who stood before him. "Is it true?" he asked. "Do you refuse to worship the image I have set up?" Shadrach answered, and his voice was steady, not defiant, not provocative, simply clear. "O king, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king." He paused, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of something already decided, already surrendered, already released. "But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." The scrolls would later record these words in the book of Daniel, chapter 3. The king's face flushed with rage. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, so hot that the soldiers who threw the 3 young men into the flames were themselves consumed by the heat. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell, bound and clothed, into the heart of the fire. What happened next would be told and retold for generations. Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet, his face pale, his voice shaking. "Were not 3 men thrown into the fire?" he demanded of his advisors. "Certainly, O king. Look," he cried. "I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods." When they emerged from the furnace, their robes were not scorched, their hair was not singed. They did not even smell of smoke. And the king, shaken to his core, issued a new decree. No one in the empire was to speak against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But for the 3 young men, the miracle was not the survival, it was the presence. In the moment when the fire closed around them and the cost of their faithfulness became real, they had not been alone. Someone had walked with them through the flames. Someone had stood beside them in the place where everything else had been stripped away. Today, there may be no golden statues rising from desert plains, and no kings commanding us to kneel at the sound of music. Yet there are masters still, not crowned in gold, but disguised in appetite, ambition, addiction, approval, and fear. They do not threaten us with fire. They promise comfort. They promise belonging. They promise relief. And when the music of the moment begins to play, the pressure to bow can feel just as real. The furnace has changed form. It is no longer brick and flame, but the slow burning of a life surrendered to what does not truly love you. A habit that consumes. A craving that erodes dignity. A compromise that seemed small at first, but grows quietly over time. A crowd that bends in one direction, and the subtle message that survival requires you to bend with it. When everyone around you kneels to what is counterfeit, standing can feel isolating. It can cost friendships, approval, reputation, opportunity. But the story of these 3 young men is not about political defiance. It is about interior allegiance. It is about choosing who your master will be before the music starts. And that choice still shapes destinies. And that presence, they knew, had been there all along. In the quiet nights of exile, in the small acts of faithfulness no one else noticed, in the daily choice to remember who they were when the empire tried to tell them otherwise. Courage, they had learned, was not the certainty of rescue. It was the willingness to stand regardless. If this tension feels familiar, share this story with someone who needs courage today. Centuries later, a different city, a different kind of furnace. A woman sits at a conference table, her hands folded over a folder she has prepared with care. Around her, colleagues shift in their seats, avoiding her eyes. The decision before them is clear. Sign the document that everyone knows contains a lie, or refuse and face the consequences. She thinks of her family, her mortgage, the years she has worked to reach this position. She thinks of how easy it would be to simply sign, to go along, to tell herself that it does not matter, that one signature on one document will not change anything. But she also thinks of something else, a presence she cannot see but has come to trust, a still, quiet voice that does not promise safety but offers something better, a companionship in the cost. She sets down her pen. She shakes her head. The same courage that walked with 3 young men through the flames still walks with those who refuse to bow today. It has not changed. It is still quiet. It is still costly. And that courage is still not alone. The streets of Jerusalem were never truly quiet, but in the hour before dawn, they came close. The shuttered windows of the upper city held back the lamplight of early risers, and the narrow lanes of the lower quarters lay empty except for the occasional figure hurrying toward work or prayer. The Temple Mount rose above it all, its massive stones catching the first pale light of the east, its courts already stirring with priests preparing for the morning sacrifice. Peter walked through the waking city with the memory of chains still fresh on his wrists. He was not a young man anymore. The decades since Galilee had marked him in ways that went deeper than the gray in his beard, or the lines that had gathered at the corners of his eyes. He had been a fisherman once, impulsive and quick to speak, quick to promise, quick to fail. He had drawn a sword in a garden and run away before dawn. He had warmed himself by a fire while the one he loved was led to execution, and 3 times he had denied knowing him. That memory never fully left. It lived in him like an old wound, not bleeding anymore, but present, a reminder of what he was capable of when fear took hold. But something else lived in him too, something that had been kindled on another morning, when the stone had been rolled away and the linen cloths lay empty, and a familiar voice had called his name by the shore of the sea. "You know that I love you. Feed my sheep." And Peter had been feeding them ever since. In the crowded streets of Jerusalem, in the homes of believers, in the temple courts where he spoke openly about what he had seen and heard. The word spread as the community grew, while the authorities watched with mounting concern. This was the second arrest. The first had ended with warning stern words from the council elders, threats of consequences if the apostles continued to speak about the man they claimed had risen from the dead. Peter and the others had listened politely, inclined their heads respectfully, and returned immediately to the temple courts to continue teaching. Because what were threats compared to a promise? What was the anger of men compared to the command of the one who had walked out of the grave? The second arrest had come in the night. Temple guards had taken them to the public jail, placing them in cells that smelled of damp stone and human despair. But when morning came, the cells were empty, even though doors remained locked with the guards still standing at their posts. But the prisoners were simply gone. An angel freed them, they would later say. This divine messenger instructed them to go, stand in the temple courts, and tell the people the full message of this new life. So Peter walked again toward the temple, his feet finding the familiar path, his heart carrying the strange calm that had become his constant companion since that morning by the sea. The others joined him as the sun rose higher. John, who had stood at the foot of the cross when Peter had fled. James, whose intensity had once earned him the name Son of Thunder, but had since settled into something steadier. Andrew, Thomas, Philip, the rest. They entered the temple courts together, and they began to teach. It was not long before the guards found them. The high priest's face was tight with fury when they were brought before the council, the same council that had condemned their teacher, the same chamber where the fate of this troublesome movement would be decided. The morning light slanted through high windows, falling upon the seated elders in their fine robes, upon the scribes with their tablets, upon the captain of the temple guard who had personally supervised the arrest. "We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name," the high priest said, his voice controlled but sharp. Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood." Peter stood at the front of the group, his calloused hands hanging loose at his sides, his weathered face unreadable. Behind him, the other apostles waited in silence. The air in the chamber was thick with tension, with accusation, with the gathered weight of two worlds pressing against each other. And Peter opened his mouth to speak, but not the way he would have spoken in the garden, all fire and bravado. Not the way he would have spoken by the fire, all fear and evasion. Something had changed in the years since then. The impulse to perform, to prove, to defend himself had slowly been replaced by something simpler, quieter, more settled. He spoke the words that would echo through centuries, as recorded in the book of Acts, chapter 5, verse 29. We must obey God rather than men. There was no anger in his voice, no challenge. Voices rose in fury. Some wanted to execute the apostles on the spot, to make an example that would silence this dangerous teaching once and for all. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, respected by all the people, rose to speak, and his words introduced caution into the chaos. "Leave these men alone," he counseled. "If this movement is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop it. You will only find yourselves fighting against God." His words carried weight. The council relented, though not entirely. The apostles were beaten, a humiliation meant to discourage and degrade, and they were ordered once more never to speak in the name of Jesus. Peter felt the blows land across his back. He tasted blood where he had bitten his tongue to keep from crying out. He felt the shame that was meant to break him, to remind him of his place, to teach him the cost of disobedience. But as he left the council chamber with the others, something unexpected rose in his chest. Not anger, not despair. Something that felt almost like joy. They had been counted worthy to suffer for the name. The beating had not silenced them. If anything, it had confirmed what they already knew, that the path they walked was the same path their teacher had walked before them. That faithfulness was not measured by comfort or safety, but by willingness. That courage did not require the absence of consequences, only the presence of something more valuable than avoiding them. The apostles returned to the temple courts the very next day. They continued teaching. They continued speaking. They continued standing. Not because they did not understand the risk. They understood it better than most. But because they had tasted something that the council could not take away, a presence that had walked with them through every threat, every imprisonment, every blow. The same presence that had met Peter on the shore and restored what shame had tried to destroy. The same presence that had filled an upper room with wind and fire and turned frightened fishermen into witnesses. They must obey God rather than men, not because it was easy, but because it was true. Not because they were brave, but because they had learned that courage grows not from the absence of fear, but from the presence of one who is greater than every fear. Three moments separated by centuries. Three choices made by ordinary men who understood that faithfulness is rarely convenient and courage is almost never comfortable. Joshua did not know what lay beyond the river. He only knew who walked beside him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not know if the flames would consume them. They only knew that bowing to what was false would cost them something more valuable than their lives. Peter and the apostles did not know if their movement would survive, if their teaching would spread, if anyone would remember their names a generation later. They only knew that silence would be a betrayal of everything they had seen and heard and been transformed by. And in each of these moments, the courage that sustained them was not the kind that shouts or struts or draws attention to itself. It was the quiet kind, the settled kind, the kind that simply refuses to surrender what matters most, even when surrender would be so much easier. Perhaps you recognize this struggle. Perhaps you have stood at your own threshold, faced your own furnace, been summoned before your own council. Perhaps you have felt the pressure to go along, to stay quiet, to bow just slightly so that no one notices, to tell yourself that it does not matter, that one small compromise will not change anything. But it does change things. Every bowed knee changes something. Every silent tongue makes a choice. Every step away from what we know to be true takes us somewhere new, somewhere we may not have intended to go. The good news is this: the presence that walked with Joshua, that stood with the 3 young men in the flames, that sustained the apostles through beatings and threats and ridicule, is the same presence available to everyone who dares to stand. It has not diminished. It has not grown tired. It waits only to be invited, to be trusted, to be allowed to do what it has always done, to walk with frightened people into uncertain futures, and to remind them that they are not alone. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to stand while the fear remains, trusting that the ground beneath our feet is held by someone stronger than ourselves. May you find that ground when the moment of choice arrives. May you discover that quiet courage is still courage, and that calm conviction carries further than shouting ever could. And may you know, in the deepest part of yourself, that when you stand for what is true, you do not stand alone. If this story speaks to you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe so that these stories can keep reaching those who need them. The courage to stand may feel costly, but you are not alone in the standing.
Thank you for sharing this sacred story with me. If it touched your heart, you may also find peace and clarity in our Meditative Reflections playlist, a series of guided meditations inspired by these very Bible stories. Each one is crafted to help you slow down, breathe deeply, and connect more fully with God's presence in your life. Remember to subscribe, leave a comment if something resonated with you, and share this with someone who may need a little hope today. Until next time, transforming minds and empowering souls, and as always, peace, love, light, and unity.